Welcome to the story of a man who taught the world how to live with wisdom. This is not just history. This is not just philosophy. This is a journey into a mind that believed kindness was stronger than power, that knowledge without virtue was dangerous, and that peace begins not with governments, but with the human heart. If you're someone who's learning English, this story is perfect for you, because you won't just learn words, you'll learn meaning. You'll experience English that feels alive, words that carry emotion, rhythm, and truth. By the end of this story, you won't just understand English better, you'll understand yourself better too. More than 2,500 years ago, before there were skyscrapers or smartphones, before the Roman Empire or the modern world, China was in chaos. The great Zhou dynasty, once a symbol of harmony and virtue, was collapsing. Power-hungry warlords fought endless battles. Villages were burned, families divided, and truth was drowned by ambition. The old traditions of respect, duty, and family honor were fading. Children no longer listened to their parents. Rulers no longer cared for their people. And ordinary people no longer believed that goodness could survive. It was a time when the world was full of noise, but empty of wisdom. In this time of disorder, in a small and quiet state called Lu, a child was born. His name was Kong Shu. The world would later know him as Confucius. He was not born into wealth or luxury. He did not have armies or power. His father, a brave soldier, died when the boy was only 3 years old, leaving his mother to raise him alone. Together they lived simply, surviving on little, guided not by privilege but by values, honesty, kindness, and hard work. From a young age, Confucius was different. While other children played, he observed. While others spoke, he listened. He asked questions that adults struggled to answer. Why do people fight when they could cooperate? Why do leaders seek power but ignore virtue? Why do humans know what is right, yet choose what is wrong? Even as a child, Confucius searched for something deeper, a truth that could bring peace to both the world and the heart. He studied everything he could find: ancient poems, songs, rituals, and the stories of old kings who ruled with justice and compassion. His mother taught him that true nobility does not come from birth, but from behavior. And as the young boy grew, he began to dream of a world where people lived not for wealth or power, but for goodness. That dream would one day change all of China, and later the world. But for now, he was still just a boy, standing at the edge of history, holding one simple belief: that wisdom begins with the desire to become a better person. So, as you listen to this story, don't just think of it as a lesson in history or philosophy. Think of it as a mirror, a reflection of yourself. The story of Confucius is the story of every human being who has ever asked, "How should I live?" It is the story of a teacher who believed that learning and goodness walk hand in hand, and that even one voice, when guided by truth, can bring harmony to a broken world. This is the beginning of that voice. This is the story of Confucius, the man who taught the world to think with the heart, the child of a broken age. Confucius was born in the year 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, during one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in Chinese history. The great Zhou dynasty, once known for its harmony and order, was dying. Its kings had lost their power. The empire had broken into dozens of small states, each ruled by ambitious warlords who fought endlessly for land, control, and pride. Armies marched across villages, smoke filled the air, families were divided by conflict, and people no longer trusted their rulers. It was a world drowning in noise, the noise of greed, violence, and confusion. Amid this turmoil, in a modest house surrounded by the sounds of war and wind, a child took his first breath. His name was Kong Qiu, the boy who would one day be called Confucius. He did not come from luxury or privilege. His father, Kong He, had been a soldier, strong, respected, and known for his discipline. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, came from a poor family, but carried within her a deep sense of virtue and faith. Together they belonged to a family of noble blood, but humble life. When Confucius was still very young, tragedy struck. His father died, leaving the family with little more than honor and memory. His mother raised him alone, facing hardship with quiet strength. They had no servants, no wealth, and no protection from the storms of the world. Yet in that simplicity, something powerful began to grow. The seed of humility, a word that means to be strong without pride. Confucius learned this not from books, but from watching his mother. She worked every day with discipline, spoke softly to her neighbors, and faced every challenge without complaint. From her, he learned that true virtue is not about status or appearance. It is about the choices you make when no one is watching. As a boy, Confucius was curious about everything. He watched the world like a quiet observer, always asking questions. Why did some people live in peace while others lived in anger? Why did leaders use power to harm instead of to protect? Why did people forget the values that once made them human? He listened more than he spoke, learning from the rhythm of daily life, from the way farmers tilled the land, from the songs of old travelers, and from the silence between his mother's words. Even in his early years, he carried an air of calm thoughtfulness. Other children boasted or argued, he reflected. When someone shouted, he stayed silent. When someone fell, he helped them rise. People began to notice something unusual about the boy, a kind of natural respect, not the kind forced by fear, but the kind earned through kindness. This respect became his foundation, a quiet power that would later shape his entire philosophy. At the age of 7, Confucius began to imitate rituals he had seen at the local temple. He would line up bowls, light small candles, and bow 3 times before an invisible altar. It was play, but it was also purpose. He was fascinated by order, by the beauty of doing things with care. What others saw as meaningless tradition, he saw as discipline, the art of bringing peace through structure. This was the beginning of Lai, the Confucian idea of proper conduct, the balance between action and morality. But life was not easy. Poverty followed them. There were nights when they had little to eat. Confucius would look at his mother and see the tiredness in her eyes, yet she never gave up. From her endurance, he learned another word that would define his life: discipline. Discipline, he realized, was not about force. It was about consistency. It was about doing what is right even when life gives you every reason to stop. As the boy grew, so did his mind. He began reading whatever he could find: poems, songs, records of ancient kings who ruled with wisdom. He was drawn to the stories of men who led not with swords, but with principles. His mother encouraged him to learn, telling him, "Knowledge is a lantern in darkness." He took those words deeply to heart. In time, people in his village began to call him the thoughtful one. When disputes arose, neighbors sometimes asked the young Confucius to listen and give his opinion. He spoke softly but clearly. He never took sides. Instead, he asked questions until both sides understood each other. Even as a child, he was a teacher, not by authority, but by presence. Confucius's early life was shaped by loss, struggle, and observation, but instead of breaking him, it built him. The chaos around him became his classroom. The silence within him became his strength. He had learned something most people never do, that wisdom is born not from comfort, but from hardship, not from command, but from compassion. In a world of noise and conflict, a quiet boy from Lu was beginning to form a philosophy that would echo for millennia. That true greatness is not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how deeply you think, how gently you act, and how humbly you live. And so, in the middle of a broken age, the seed of a sage was planted. The scholar who sought harmony. As Confucius grew, so did his hunger, not for wealth or comfort, but for knowledge. He became what we call a scholar, a person devoted to study, not for reward, but for truth itself. In a time when few could read or write, when knowledge was guarded by the powerful, Confucius dreamed of opening the gates of wisdom to all who wished to learn. He believed that the mind was like a field. The more you cultivated it, the more goodness it could grow. From sunrise to sunset, Confucius studied everything he could find: rituals, poetry, history, and ethics. Rituals taught him the rhythm of respect. Poetry taught him the music of emotion. History taught him the lessons of the past. And ethics taught him how to live with integrity. For him, learning was not a task. It was devotion, a sacred act of shaping the soul. He often said, "Learning without thinking is useless. Thinking without learning is dangerous." These words became his compass. He believed that knowledge alone was not enough. It needed reflection, balance, and purpose. A wise person, he said, is one who studies deeply and then acts kindly. For Confucius, education was not about filling the mind. It was about refining the heart. In the quiet mornings of Lu, villagers would see him walking along dirt paths, a simple bundle of scrolls on his back, a calm expression on his face. He would travel miles to meet a teacher, a poet, or a musician, anyone from whom he could learn something new. He would sit in silence, listen with focus, and ask questions until his understanding felt complete. Sometimes he would bow to an elder. Other times, he would thank a farmer or a craftsman. To him, wisdom could come from any person, any place, any moment. He studied not for money. He studied not for fame. He studied for balance. Every book he read, every conversation he shared, every lesson he learned became a step on his path toward harmony, a word that meant more to him than peace. To Confucius, harmony was the music of life itself, when people lived not as enemies, but as parts of one whole. Just as different instruments blend to form a melody, he believed that human beings, too, could live in rhythm if guided by virtue and respect. His devotion to learning was unshakable. Even when he grew tired, he continued to study. Even when mocked for his seriousness, he continued to ask questions. People around him began to call him the man of purpose, because his actions always carried direction. He wasn't trying to escape life's struggles. He was trying to understand them. At times, Confucius would walk through busy markets or crowded streets and watch people shout, trade, and argue. He saw rulers chasing power, merchants chasing profit, and workers chasing survival. He wondered, what if people chased virtue instead? What if the purpose of life was not to win, but to live rightly? That question became his dream, to create a society guided not by violence, but by virtue. He imagined a world where rulers led with kindness, not fear, where families lived with respect, not rivalry, where every person, rich or poor, could find dignity through learning and moral growth. For him, education was the bridge between chaos and order, between ignorance and enlightenment. Confucius saw that when a person learns only for reward, learning becomes shallow. But when a person learns for truth, learning becomes transformation. He wanted his people, and one day all of humanity, to see education not as a path to power, but as a path to peace. In the evenings, Confucius would often stand beneath the stars, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes lifted to the heavens. He would whisper to himself, "The universe has order. Why can't human life have the same?" To him, harmony was not just a dream, it was a duty. It began with one person deciding to live rightly, and it spread like light from soul to soul. And so, Confucius studied on. He learned from kings and beggars, from elders and children, from nature and silence itself. Every question he asked brought him closer to understanding that knowledge without kindness is empty, and kindness without knowledge is blind. He believed the two must walk together, side by side, in the service of truth. He was still far from being the great teacher history would remember. But the foundation was set. The boy who once asked why had now found his how. He would dedicate his life to the harmony of the world, through wisdom, through example, and through words that would echo for thousands of years. The teacher of 10,000 minds. As the years passed, Confucius's reputation as a man of learning began to spread beyond the quiet borders of Lu. People spoke of a teacher who lived simply, spoke gently, and treated every question, no matter how small, with dignity. He had no wealth to give, no title to claim, no army to command. Yet people walked for miles just to hear him speak. Why? Because his words were not about power, they were about purpose. Confucius had come to believe that the true strength of a nation was not measured by its soldiers or its gold, but by the education of its people. He dreamed of a world where wisdom flowed like water, reaching everyone who thirsted for it. At that time in China, education was a privilege reserved for the rich and the noble. The poor were expected to serve, not to think. But Confucius challenged that belief. He declared something revolutionary, that learning should be open to anyone, regardless of wealth, class, or background. So, he opened a small school, the first private academy in Chinese history. It stood not in a palace or temple, but in a humble courtyard surrounded by bamboo and open air. There were no marble floors or golden halls, only wooden benches, bamboo mats, and a few scrolls of wisdom. In the early mornings, when the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, his students would gather, some in silk robes, others in plain cloth, all equal in the circle of learning. They would sit cross-legged, ink brushes ready, their minds open. Confucius would walk slowly among them, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes calm and kind. He did not lecture. He asked, "What does it mean to be good? What is the duty of a son?" How can a ruler win the trust of his people? And as the students answered, he would ask again, deeper, gentler, guiding them to discover the truth within themselves. He believed that teaching was not about filling minds, but awakening them. His method, conversation, questioning, reflection, was the seed of something the world would later call the Socratic method. But long before Socrates, there was Confucius, walking among his students, teaching by asking, not telling. He would often remind them, when you read, you grow. When you speak, you think. When you listen, you learn. Each lesson was more than grammar or philosophy. It was a lesson in life. He taught that learning was not confined to scrolls or classrooms. It was in every act of kindness, every mistake corrected, every moment of silence used for thought. Sometimes a young student would bow too deeply before him, head lowered to the ground. Confucius would gently lift him up and say, "Stand straight, so your thoughts can rise higher." He wanted his students to learn respect, but not fear, discipline, but not submission. To him, the goal of education was to form not obedient subjects, but noble minds, people who could think clearly, act justly, and live honorably. The students loved him, not because he made them feel small, but because he made them feel capable. They were encouraged to question, to disagree, even to challenge their master, as long as they did so with sincerity. Confucius taught that disagreement was not disrespect. It was the beginning of understanding. Day by day, his academy grew. Dozens became hundreds. Young men came from distant states, carrying food wrapped in cloth, eager to sit beneath the bamboo trees and learn from the sage of Lu. Many would later become advisors, ministers, and teachers themselves. But when they were asked what Confucius had truly taught them, they rarely spoke of politics or rituals. They said, "He taught us to live." His lessons were simple, but powerful. The noble person seeks harmony, not uniformity, he would say. He does not demand that others think like him, only that they think with reason. To Confucius, harmony was not everyone being the same. It was everyone learning to live together in balance, different, yet connected. Through his teaching, he built not an empire, but a community of minds, bound by shared values, mutual respect, and the pursuit of virtue. His academy was a garden of thought, and he tended it with patience and love. Under the morning light, the sound of students reciting filled the air like music. To learn and practice what is learned, is that not a joy? They would chant, echoing their master's words. In this small courtyard, something extraordinary was happening. Knowledge was no longer the possession of the elite. It was becoming the birthright of humanity. And the man who made it possible did so with nothing but a brush, a voice, and a vision. Confucius believed that if you wanted to change a nation, you had to start by teaching one person, because every wise student would one day become a wise parent, a wise friend, or a wise leader. Education, he said, was the foundation of civilization, the invisible bridge between chaos and peace. And as his students sat beneath the rustling bamboo, listening to his quiet voice, they were not just learning the words of a man. They were learning the language of humanity, the language of respect, balance, and moral purpose. In time, these students would carry his wisdom far beyond the borders of Lu. They would become the seeds of something vast, an intellectual forest that would shape China for more than 2,000 years. For now, though, In that small courtyard filled with morning light, one teacher stood before 10,000 minds and changed the world with questions, not answers. The philosopher in exile. For many years, Confucius had dreamed of a world guided by virtue, not violence. He believed that if a ruler could lead with kindness and wisdom, the people would follow with loyalty and peace. His fame as a teacher had spread across the land, and soon rulers began to notice. They invited him to their courts, hoping to gain from his knowledge, or to use it for their own ambitions. When Confucius first stood before kings and ministers, he did not flatter them. He spoke the same way he taught his students, honestly, humbly, and directly. A ruler, he said, must lead by virtue, just as the North Star leads the other stars, by staying true. Some listened with curiosity. Others smiled politely and ignored him. For many, his words were too pure for the politics of power. They wanted strategy, not sincerity, control, not compassion. Yet Confucius did not change his message. He spoke of justice, honesty, and dignity, words that made powerful men uncomfortable. He refused to bend the truth to please anyone. One ruler asked him, "How can I make my people obey me?" Confucius replied, "If you are righteous, they will follow naturally. If you are not, even if you command them, they will not." It was advice few wanted to hear. His mission to restore virtue through government failed again and again. Ministers whispered that he was naive. Generals mocked his faith in morality. Eventually, rulers turned their backs on him, and the doors of the courts closed one by one. But Confucius did not despair. When power rejected him, he turned to the people. He packed his scrolls, gathered a few loyal disciples, and began a journey that would last 13 years, a journey through mountains and deserts, through villages and cities, through hunger, rain, and rejection. He became what the world would later call the philosopher in exile. Everywhere he went, he taught. In village squares, he spoke to farmers about honesty. By riverbanks, he taught travelers about patience. In temples, he shared stories of virtue with monks and children. He owned almost nothing, but he carried something far more valuable: wisdom. The years were harsh. There were days when his followers had no food. There were nights when they slept under open skies, cold and weak. Yet when his students began to lose hope, Confucius would smile and say, "Do not fear hardship. The path of truth is never straight, but it always leads forward." His calmness gave them strength. Once, during a storm, a student asked, "Master, why do people reject the truth if it brings harmony?" Confucius looked out at the rain and said softly, "It is not the truth that abandons men, but men who abandon truth." The student never forgot those words. Every rejection, every closed door, every insult became a test of perseverance. Confucius understood that virtue means nothing if it only lives in comfort. True virtue shines in adversity, when the world turns away and yet you still choose to be kind, honest, and steady. He was mocked, misunderstood, and often ignored, but he never stopped teaching. The world turned its back on him, but he never turned his back on the world. He believed that the purpose of wisdom was not to escape life, but to improve it, even if no one listens. In those long years of wandering, Confucius became more than a teacher. He became a mirror of what he taught, patient, humble, resilient. His clothes were worn, his hands rough, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes still carried the same calm fire that had guided him since childhood. He was proof that dignity does not come from status. It comes from staying loyal to your values, no matter where the road leads. He once told his disciples, "A noble man stands firm in the face of hardship. When the path is dark, he becomes his own lantern." It was this faith, quiet but unbreakable, that turned his exile into enlightenment. For English learners listening to this, remember, even when people reject your words still have power. Every phrase you learn, every thought you express can travel farther than you imagine. Confucius's words were ignored in his time, yet they are spoken today in languages he never knew. So when the world doubts you, do as he did. Keep learning, keep speaking, keep walking your path with truth. Because wisdom, like light, may be hidden by clouds, but it never dies. The return of wisdom. After 13 long years of wandering, teaching, and enduring hardship, Confucius finally returned home. He was 68 years old, his beard white, his steps slower, but his spirit as steady as ever. He had walked through storms and kingdoms, faced rejection and exile, yet his eyes still carried peace. He had not changed the rulers of his time, but he had changed something far greater, himself. The small state of Lu welcomed him quietly. There were no celebrations, no parades. Most of the nobles had forgotten him, but his students had not. They gathered around their teacher again, eager to hear his thoughts, to preserve his words, to make sure that the wisdom he carried would not be lost to time. Confucius understood that even if the world had not yet listened, the future might. And so, he began his final and most important task, to write, to teach, and to pass on his philosophy to the generations that would come after him. Each morning, under the gentle shade of trees, Confucius would sit on a low wooden stool surrounded by his disciples. The air was filled with the sound of ink brushes scratching across bamboo strips, the ancient paper of China. Birds sang softly in the distance, and the sun filtered through the leaves like golden dust. His students would read aloud the master's words, and Confucius would nod or correct them, his voice calm and deliberate. These moments became the foundation of a book that would survive for over 2,000 years, the Analects. The Analects was not written as a grand speech or a royal document. It was a collection of conversations, simple words, short sentences, deep meanings. His students recorded what he said about life, leadership, kindness, and morality. Together, they created a map of wisdom, not for kings, but for everyone. In those final years, Confucius spoke often about 5 great principles, ideas that would become the pillars of his teaching. He believed that if every person lived by these 5 virtues, peace would return to the world. These were Ren, Li, Yi, Ji, and Xin. The first, Ren, means benevolence or kindness. It is the heart of all virtue, the ability to care for others as you care for yourself. Confucius said, "The person of Ren desires to establish others as he wishes to be established himself." In simple words, when you help someone rise, you rise too. When you speak gently, when you forgive, when you choose kindness over cruelty, you practice Ren. The second virtue is Li, meaning ritual or propriety. But for Confucius, Li was not just about ceremonies or tradition. It meant respect in daily life. How you speak to elders, how you behave in society, how you honor the invisible rules of harmony. When you hold a door for someone, when you say thank you, when you listen before replying. That is Li in action. The third virtue, Yi, stands for righteousness, doing what is right, not what is easy. Confucius believed that a person should always act from moral strength, even if no one is watching. Yi is when you tell the truth, even when lies would be simpler. Yi is when you return a lost wallet, even though you could have kept it. Yi is justice in everyday life. The fourth, Zhi, means wisdom. But for Confucius, wisdom was not about intelligence or memory. It was about seeing clearly, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to wait. Wisdom, he taught, comes from reflection, not reaction. When you pause to understand instead of rushing to judge, you practice Zhi. And the fifth, Xin, means trust or faithfulness. Confucius said, "Without trust we cannot stand." He believed that a society cannot survive if people do not keep their word. Xin is keeping promises. Xin is showing up when you say you will. Xin is the quiet strength that builds connection between hearts. Ren, Li, Yi, Ji, Xin. 5 words, 5 virtues, 1 foundation for humanity. Confucius believed that if even one person practiced these daily, they could bring balance to their family, their community, and their world. For English learners, these 5 words are more than vocabulary. They are lessons in life. Ren teaches kindness, Li teaches respect, Yi teaches integrity, Ji teaches understanding, Xin teaches trust. Together, they form the moral alphabet of humanity. In those peaceful years back in Lu, Confucius became something more than a philosopher. He became a living symbol of endurance, proof that ideas can outlast rejection, that virtue can outshine ambition, and that wisdom does not fade with age. He had failed to reform governments, but he had succeeded in reforming minds. His students carried his teachings like sacred seeds, ready to plant them wherever they went. Each day after teaching, Confucius would look out at the horizon. He no longer dreamed of palaces or kings. He dreamed of classrooms under trees, of families filled with respect, of children growing up with honesty in their hearts. He often said, "To educate without discrimination, to guide without pride, this is the greatest joy." In the quiet evenings, when the lessons ended, his students would bow, and Confucius would smile. He had no throne, no title, no army, but he possessed something far greater, a legacy of virtue that would guide the world long after his footsteps faded from the earth. The immortal teacher. The final years of Confucius's life were quiet, filled with teaching, reflection, and writing. The man who had walked through chaos now lived surrounded by peace. His days began with study and ended with conversation. His students, many of whom had followed him through years of hardship, now sat beside him as equals, not just as learners, but as keepers of his wisdom. He no longer spoke of governments or kings. He spoke of balance, family, and the heart. He told his students, "The noble man seeks within himself. The small man seeks in others." His voice had grown softer, but its power had not faded. Every word carried the calm certainty of experience. And then, one spring morning, the time came for the teacher to rest. He was around 72 years old, his hair as white as the clouds above the hills of Lu. As the light filled his small home, he sat surrounded by his disciples, scrolls, and memories. He spoke gently to those around him, not about fear or sorrow, but about gratitude, gratitude for learning, for friendship, and for truth. He closed his eyes and said, If virtue is not yet fulfilled in me, may it live in you." And with that blessing, he passed away, quietly, peacefully, as he had lived. There were no royal funerals, no golden monuments. But there was something far greater: devotion. His students wept not only for their teacher, but for the light that had guided their lives. They built a simple tomb and planted trees around it. For 3 years they mourned, refusing to leave the place where he rested. Some never left at all. Others left carrying his words like sacred fire across valleys, mountains, and generations. Through them, Confucius did not die. He began to live again. In every lesson, every story, every heart that sought wisdom over wealth, his disciples became teachers. Their students became scholars. Within a few generations, his ideas spread across China like morning sunlight touching every corner of the land. Kings who once ignored him now ordered his words to be studied. Governments began to base their laws not only on power, but on virtue. The common people learned that respect was not weakness, but strength. Families began teaching children the value of kindness, honesty, and duty. By the time of the Han Dynasty, more than a century after his death, Confucius's philosophy had become the moral foundation of the empire. The emperors declared his teachings essential to the education of every official. His book, The Analects, became a guide for life, for leaders, teachers, and ordinary citizens alike. Scholars copied his writings by hand, filling libraries and temples with his words. From China, his ideas traveled across Asia, to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, shaping entire civilizations. In each land, people found in Confucius a mirror of their highest values: harmony in families, respect for elders, honesty in work, and responsibility in leadership. Even centuries later, when empires rose and fell, his voice remained steady, like a compass pointing humanity back toward balance. He never ruled, he never fought, but he conquered hearts. That was his true legacy: not palaces or armies, but influence that reached beyond time. He became the teacher of nations, the philosopher of civilization. His words formed the silent language of ethics that still guides millions of lives today. When a parent teaches a child to say thank you, when a student bows to a teacher, when a leader chooses fairness over greed, that is Confucius speaking through the ages. His lessons became the heartbeat of cultures, reminding the world that greatness is not in domination, but in character. For English learners, his life is a lesson in itself. The word legacy means what you leave behind, not in money, but in meaning. Confucius's legacy was a world more conscious of goodness. The word influence means the power to affect others even when you are gone, and his influence stretches from ancient China to modern classrooms around the world. And civilization, the progress of human society, grew richer because one teacher chose to believe that wisdom belongs to everyone. So when you study, when you speak, when you act with integrity, remember this: Confucius is not just in the pages of history, he is in you. His dream was never to be remembered. His dream was to make others remember the power of virtue. He once said, "The wise find joy in water, the virtuous find joy in mountains. The water flows and changes like knowledge, the mountain stands firm like goodness. In both there is beauty. In both there is peace." And that is how Confucius lives on, not as a king, but as a current of wisdom still flowing through the river of time, nourishing the heart of civilization. The hidden journey of his words. After Confucius's death, his disciples carried his teachings across the land, preserving them in scrolls and memory. His words, soft as wind yet sharp as truth, began to echo through villages, schools, and temples. But the world he left behind would soon face darkness again. A century later, China was united under a powerful new ruler, Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who built the Great Wall. He was a visionary in ambition, but a tyrant in rule. He wanted to control everything, the land, the people, even their thoughts. He ordered that all philosophies except his own should be destroyed. Books that questioned authority were seen as dangerous, and among them were the writings of Confucius. One night, the emperor's soldiers moved through the cities, carrying torches. Flames rose high into the sky as scrolls turned to ash. Scholars who refused to surrender their books were executed. It was one of the darkest moments in history, the burning of books and the burying of scholars. The goal was simple: to erase the past, to silence independent thought, to destroy the voice of Confucius. But truth, like light, cannot be destroyed, only hidden. Some brave scholars risked their lives to save the words of the master. They hid bamboo strips in walls, buried scrolls beneath floors, and memorized passages line by line so they could be rewritten later. The fire consumed the paper, but not the ideas. The words of Confucius went underground, invisible, silent, waiting for the world to be ready again. For a time, it seemed his voice had vanished. The empire marched forward, but without its moral compass. Power grew, but peace did not. Order was forced, not earned. Yet beneath the surface, something was stirring, the seeds of wisdom, sleeping under the ashes. Then, more than 100 years later, the Han dynasty rose. These new rulers wanted stability, not fear. They searched for guidance, for a philosophy that could unite the people with virtue instead of violence. And in that search, they rediscovered Confucius. His words, preserved in fragments and memories, began to reappear. Scholars gathered the lost writings, reassembled the Analects, and made them part of the national education system. Confucianism was reborn, not through conquest, but through conviction. It became the moral foundation of government and society. The emperor himself bowed before the teachings once forbidden by his predecessor. Schools reopened, and young minds once again studied the wisdom of the sage of Lu. But history, like life, moves in cycles. Centuries later, new dynasties rose and fell. Wars came and went. Empires forgot, then remembered again. During the Song dynasty, over 1,000 years after Confucius's time, his philosophy was reborn once more, this time as Neo-Confucianism, a deeper blend of ethics, spirituality, and reason. Thinkers like Zhu Xi revived his teachings, linking them with science, art, and human nature. They believed that Confucius had not only taught morality, he had taught how to understand the universe itself. From the Song dynasty onward, Confucian wisdom became the backbone of East Asian culture. For more than 2,000 years, his teachings guided emperors, teachers, and families. Even when wars swept across China, when new religions entered, when dynasties collapsed, his spirit remained, quiet but unbroken. In modern times, Confucius's ideas continue to live, in classrooms, in families, in governments, and even in daily speech. His emphasis on respect for parents, teachers, and moral behavior shaped not only China but also Japan, Korea, and beyond. And today, his wisdom reaches the entire world through translation, philosophy, and education. It is a story of survival, of words stronger than weapons, of truth more patient than time. His words were hunted, burned, forgotten, and rediscovered. Yet they never truly disappeared. Because words, like seeds, may vanish for a season, but they always grow again. For English learners, this story is also your story. Every new word you learn, every phrase you remember, is a seed planted in your mind. It may not bloom today, but one day it will. Confucius's journey reminds us that learning is never wasted, that even when forgotten, knowledge waits quietly for the right moment to return. So when you study, when you struggle, when you feel like you're not making progress, think of those hidden scrolls, buried but alive. Wisdom may sleep, but it never dies. And one day, like the words of Confucius, your learning will rise again, stronger, brighter, and everlasting. The modern mind and ancient heart. Centuries have passed since Confucius walked the earth, yet his spirit still lives quietly in our world today. His words are not locked in temples or old scrolls. They live in every moment when someone chooses kindness over anger, truth over comfort, and understanding over judgment. In a world of speed, screens, and endless noise, his wisdom feels more necessary than ever. We build machines that think, but forget to train our hearts to feel. We chase success, but lose sight of what success truly means. Confucius reminds us that civilization begins not with invention, but with integrity, the courage to do what is right, even when no one is watching. Integrity is the bridge between knowledge and goodness, between who we are and who we should be. He taught that a harmonious life begins in the family. Respecting parents is not just tradition, it is empathy training, learning to understand another person's feelings, to see life through their eyes. When you speak gently to your parents, when you thank your teachers, when you listen to someone older with patience, you are practicing the same virtues that Confucius once taught under the trees of Lu. Respect builds connection, and connection builds peace. He also believed that learning should never end. Daily learning, he said, keeps the mind clear and the heart balanced. In today's world, that means more than reading books. It means learning from experience, from mistakes, from people who think differently. Lifelong learning is a kind of meditation. It brings order to the mind and strength to the soul. It is how we grow without growing hard, how we age without becoming old. Confucius also taught the power of example. He said that a good leader leads not by commands, but by character. This is emotional intelligence, the ability to guide others through calmness and care. When a parent shows patience, a child learns patience. When a teacher shows honesty, students learn honesty. When a leader listens, followers feel valued. The world changes not through force, but through the quiet influence of example. And in a time when everything moves fast, Confucius teaches us to slow down. He valued patience, not as waiting passively, but as acting wisely. He once said, "It does not matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop." In modern life, where we measure success by speed, patience is the forgotten virtue, the art of trusting time. Above all, Confucius believed that wisdom is not just knowing what is good, it is living it. True wisdom is practical. It is kindness in action, honesty in speech, humility in victory, and courage in loss. Wisdom is not stored in libraries. It is lived in the small choices of every day. You don't need temples or palaces to follow Confucius. You only need a calm heart and an open mind. You don't need ancient scrolls or sacred rituals. You only need to treat others as you wish to be treated, to learn something new each day, to forgive instead of blame, to lead with truth instead of pride. For English learners, this is your bridge between language and life. Every word you learn becomes more powerful when it carries meaning. When you learn the word integrity, you remember to be honest. When you learn empathy, you remember to listen. When you learn patience, you remember that growth takes time. When you learn wisdom, you remember that knowledge is only complete when it is used to help others. Confucius would say that mastering a language is like mastering yourself. It takes discipline, reflection, and practice. The more you learn, the clearer you think. The clearer you think, the kinder you become. So, as you listen to this story, as you study English, as you navigate your own life, remember, the voice of Confucius still speaks, not from the past, but through the quiet choices you make each day. His wisdom does not age because truth never grows old. Live simply, speak gently, learn endlessly, and let your modern mind carry an ancient heart. 7 timeless lessons from Confucius. Through his life, Confucius taught that wisdom is not a destination, but a daily practice, a way of living, learning, and becoming. His teachings were meant not only for kings or scholars, but for anyone who wished to grow with honesty and dignity. They were simple, human, and timeless. They still speak to every heart that searches for balance in a noisy world and to every learner who wishes to understand life through language. Confucius believed that true learning begins with humility. He once said, "The superior man is modest in speech, but exceeds in action." Real education, he taught, is never about applause or attention. It is not measured by certificates or likes, but by quiet improvement. When you study only to impress, your knowledge stays shallow. When you learn to understand, your growth becomes endless. Learn for yourself, not for praise. The greatest progress is invisible to others, but clear to your own soul. He also taught that respect is the foundation of peace. Respect, or li, was not just about bowing or using polite words. It was about recognizing the dignity of every human being. When you listen before you respond, when you speak gently even in disagreement, when you honor others' experiences, you build peace without needing power. Respect begins at home, with parents, teachers, and elders, and it spreads outward to the world. Respect creates trust, and trust creates harmony. For Confucius, the mastery of life required mastery of emotion. To lead others, he said, first learn to lead yourself. Anger, pride, and fear are storms within the mind. A wise person does not let them destroy the peace inside. Leadership begins not with control over others, but with calm over one's own heart. In our fast, reactive world, this lesson is more urgent than ever. Pause before anger. Breathe before judgment. Choose understanding instead of reaction. A calm voice can move mountains that shouting never could. Confucius also warned against revenge. He taught, repay hatred with justice and kindness with kindness. Revenge multiplies pain. Understanding ends it. To forgive is not to forget. It is to rise above. When someone hurts you, seek not punishment, but perspective. Ask what the pain has to teach you. About patience, about boundaries, about compassion. True strength lies in choosing peace over retaliation, The wise do not mirror the darkness they encounter. They light a candle instead. Another of his eternal truths was that a nation grows only when families grow in virtue. He saw the family as the seed of civilization. If love and honesty live at home, they will live in the city. If they die at home, the nation will crumble. Change begins not with government, but with example, with parents teaching truth through action, with children honoring those who came before, with brothers and sisters practicing forgiveness. Families are small schools of character where respect and kindness prepare the soul for society. Confucius believed deeply that words carry the weight of destiny. "The noble man is cautious in speech," he said, "for words shape the world." A single sentence can heal or wound, create trust or destroy it. Before you speak, ask, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? In an age of quick comments and endless opinions, this lesson matters most. Speak less, mean more. Your words are seeds. Plant them wisely, for what you say today will grow in the hearts of others tomorrow. And finally, he taught that learning is a lifelong pilgrimage. Even in his old age, Confucius said, "When I walk with two others, I find a teacher in each." He believed that everyone, rich or poor, young or old, could be a source of wisdom. Learning never ends because life never stops teaching. Each mistake, each success, each encounter adds another step on the road to understanding. To learn is to live fully. To stop learning is to stop growing. For the English learner, every new word is a footprint on that same sacred path, a sign that your mind is still walking toward truth. These lessons are not ancient rules, but living tools. Whether you are a student, a parent, or a dreamer, they whisper the same truth. You cannot change the world until you change yourself. When you learn for truth, speak with care, lead with calm, forgive with strength, and live with virtue, you carry forward the same light that Confucius once carried through the broken world of his time. Wisdom, he would remind us, is not about being perfect. It is about becoming better, every single day. The final reflection: why Confucius still speaks to you. More than 2,000 years have passed since Confucius walked among the people of Lu, yet his voice still whispers through time, gentle, steady, eternal. His wisdom has crossed mountains, oceans, and centuries to reach us, because what he taught was not bound by language, culture, or era. It was about being human, about living with balance, kindness, and self-respect in any age, in any world. He lived in an age of war and disorder. We live in an age of noise. The battlefields of his time were fought with swords and armies. Ours are fought with words, opinions, and endless distractions. The modern world moves fast, too fast. We scroll through hundreds of faces and voices each day, yet rarely stop to listen. We chase recognition but forget reflection. We fill our lives with noise but starve our hearts of meaning. And that is why Confucius still speaks to us. His calm is the cure for our chaos. His silence is stronger than our shouting. His ancient voice reminds us to slow down, to read slowly, to think deeply, to speak wisely. Every time you choose to understand instead of react, to listen instead of interrupt, to learn instead of judge, you are following the same path that he once walked. He would remind you that greatness is not born overnight. It grows stone by stone through patience and persistence. Confucius once said, "The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones." Every small effort matters. Every kind word, Every moment of focus, every act of discipline builds your character. You don't need to do everything today. You only need to begin with one word, one thought, one act of kindness. For those learning English, his philosophy offers more than motivation. It offers a method. To master a language, as to master life, you must walk the path step by step. Read slowly. Let the meaning sink in. Think deeply. Let ideas connect inside you. Speak wisely. Let your words carry truth. The more you practice mindfulness in language, the more fluent you become not just in English, but in thought itself. Confucius would tell you that learning is not about memorizing, it's about transforming. When you read, your world expands. When you reflect, your mind clears. When you speak with care, your voice gains power. These are not just skills, they are virtues. So as this story ends, take a moment to breathe. The world outside may be loud, but wisdom is quiet. You don't need temples or titles to find it, only awareness, patience, and humility. Remember that every calm decision is a victory. Every kind gesture is a lesson. Every time you choose understanding over judgment, you move one step closer to harmony, with yourself, with others, and with life. And if this story touched your heart and improved your English, subscribe to Read and Learn English.